Let's replace our gear cables. Gear cables wear and tear as we use them. When that happens, it reduces the effectiveness of our gear shifting. The cables stick inside the housings, and eventually they actually break. And when they break, you can't shift at all. So let's eliminate that problem by replacing the cables on our gears. The first step is to remove our handlebar tape. The next step is to unanchor the front derailleur cable, and the cable will pop out. Shift the rear derailleur onto the smallest cog. And now we're ready to remove the cable from the rear derailleur. Cut off the ends of the cables to make it easier to fish them through. Next, let's remove the cables from the shift levers. In order to do that, make sure that the cables are in the slack position. So shift the front derailleur shifter till it's as slack as possible. Retract the outer cable housing and then just simply push the inner cable till it starts to protrude from the shifter, like that. Okay? And now you can grab the inner wire and pull it all the way through. So unhook the cable housing and remove it from the wire. Unhook the outer cable housings from all the hangers and pull out the wire and feed it up through the housings. Feed the wire out through the rear shifter and catch the cable as it comes out and pull it through. Let's start with our fresh inner cable wire and fish it into the shift levers. Feed it in through the correct spot on here and make sure the anchor slug is fished into the housing correctly. The next step is to cut the outer cable housings to match the length of the old outers. So let's line them up and cut them. It's very important that you use proper bike cable cutters because electrical cable cutters will simply crush and fray your cables. Proper bike cable cutters are easy to use and make this job a lot easier to accomplish. Make sure that the outer cable housing has been cut cleanly. Ensure that there are no burrs on the inside of the housing. Those burrs are going to hinder the easy movement of the inner wire, causing your shifting to be very poor. Install the ferrule onto the cable and then feed the outer cable housing onto the wire and feed the whole thing back on. The next step is very important. Ensure that the ferrule that fits on the end of the outer cable is securely pressed onto the outer cable housing, and then slide that into the lever. Install the other ferrule and slide that onto the housing, and again ensure that it's securely pressed into place. Install that into the cable guide. Next, let's fish the cable through the bottom bracket cable guide. Insert it down through here. Next, insert the rear outer cable housing section onto the derailleur. Insert the plastic end into the guide and the metal end into the adjusting barrel on the rear derailleur. Make sure that it forms a nice smooth loop. The next thing is to fish the wire into the cable guide and into the housing. In order to do that, remove that from the cable guide. Cable guides usually have slots in them, making it easy to feed that in at that end, and then feed it into the cable housing at that end. Okay? Wire comes through the other side. Put that in the guide and insert the wire into the rear derailleur barrel adjustment. Make sure that the barrel adjustment has been tightened down. In other words, turn the barrel adjustment clockwise all the way in. That will give you the ability to tighten the cable. Insert the cable into the anchor bolt and just partially tighten it, just to hold the cable in place without locking the cable. Then use the locking fourth hand tool to tension the cable and lock its adjustment in place, and then use your Allen key to tighten the anchor bolt and lock the cable in place at a reasonable tension level. Remove the locking fourth hand tool and then retighten the cable anchor bolt to lock it in place. The next step is to feed the inner wire into the front shifter. Fish the wire up inside. Make sure the anchor slug has seated up inside. Next, let's fish the cable through the bottom bracket cable guide. Insert it down through here. The next step is to anchor the cable onto the front derailleur anchor bolt. So pull that into the slot on the front derailleur and just gently tighten that, just to hold it into place without actually locking the cable. And then again, we can use our locking fourth hand tool to properly tension that cable. And then tighten the anchor bolt on the cable. Then remove the locking fourth hand and complete the tightening of the front derailleur. The next step is to pre-stress the cables. You want to take out all the initial slack from the cables in order to ensure crisp and reliable shifting. So start by shifting it through all the gears and down, and that way you can stretch those cables and pre-stress them, ensuring that the cables are seated properly, that the outer housings are seated into the ferrules properly, and that they're all seated into the cable guides. Lastly, give the cables a good tug, and that is the last step in pre-stressing the cables to ensure that you don't have too much readjustment to do shortly after you start using those new cables. We've got all this extra cable to get rid of next. So using your cable cutters, cut the cables with a little bit of extra room, making sure that the cables are in the slack position before we cut them. And the same thing on the rear. And cut the cables a few inches away from the front derailleur. And do the same thing on the rear derailleur. And at this point you can crimp on your cable ends. The next step is to tune your gears in order to ensure that the cable tension is correct and that your gears are working crisply and reliably. You can just simply refer to our video called Gear Tuning. Now that your cables are replaced, it's time to tape your bars and then go for a ride. But don't forget, you're going to probably have to retune your gears a few times before your new cables finally settle in. So go out and have a great ride.